As you can see from the title of the video, we're doing a post-trib pre-wrath rapture versus a pre-trib rapture discussion tonight. Of course, Andrew Sluder, pastor of Bible Baptist Church here in Asheville, North Carolina. And we have on the other side here Project Cloud. Now, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I put out a video, a challenge, whatever you want to call it, on let me make sure my gain is up here. I think it's good. I put out a challenge to any of the anonymous accounts that would like to come on the broadcast here and discuss anything they wanted to discuss. Now, I really had in mind like the ones on Twitter, the ones that really take a liking to mocking guys like me. Hang on, got it pulled up on my phone here. Just want to make sure we're good. All right, yeah, there. That take a liking to mocking guys like me and different IFB preachers. But I actually had one on YouTube who has discussed or commented a lot about my rapture position. And so tonight he decided, we talked several weeks ago, and we finally got it scheduled for tonight. Tonight we're going to discuss the pre-trib rapture versus the post-trib pre-wrath rapture. So anyway, hope you are excited about it there. If you have any comments, you can comment there. Not saying we're going to get to them or all of them or any of them, but if you've got a comment, let me know how this thing is. My internet connection has been extremely bad today. I don't know what the deal has been. I don't know if it's got a bad case of the coronavirus or what, but anyway, but we got here his name is anonymous, or his anonymous name is Project Could. And so Project Could, thank you for coming on with us. Can you hear me?
Yeah, my pleasure. It's really looking forward to discussing this in a civil manner. I know this is a subject that not everybody wishes to engage with on, the nicest of terms, unfortunately. So, yeah, we'll see where this takes us. Yeah, it should be a great evening, and the coronavirus will not stop it.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive right in. Can everybody, hey, somebody comment really quick. I want to just make sure that this is not, somebody tell me if my connection is okay. Somebody comment and tell me if my connection, because I'm showing a horrible connection right now. So somebody comment and tell me if my connection is spotty. Let me see here.
The video is spotty, but the audio seems just fine.
The audio seems fine. Okay. I hate that. I think I know the problem, but there's nothing I don't think I can do about it at this point. So we'll continue on. All right. So why don't you go ahead and take a few minutes there and just kind of explain to us who you are and or I assume not who you are, but what you believe in. Yeah, for everybody who is asking about seeing Project Could, he is not going to be seen. So anyway, he is he's anonymous, so that's why you can't see him. All right, so go ahead and tell us a little bit about what you believe.
Sure. So I do believe in the rapture position that you could say that the new IFB is preaching, certainly led by Stephen Anderson. Some might say just because I believe like him on this that I'm therefore an Andersonite. No, I do differ from him and much of the new IFB on lots of different issues. Those have come up through the years on YouTube. And, as I've studied and learned from other people, sometimes even for people that may be radically opposed to an IFB type of position. But over the years, I've developed what I believe on the rapture and many subjects. So I am a King James Bible believer, so that is the absolute authority. If you want to prove to me, it's got to be by the book. So, we have a true standard for how to judge things. I would say in regards to the position that I hold, like the chart that Stephen Anderson, I think he had Richard Miller create that chart. I agree with much of that. I would differ on some points in that chart, but at the same time, it is such a kind of a complicated beast with the way it's designed that, yeah, there's almost guaranteed to be, if you look at each point by point, some level of disagreement that somebody could have. But that is what I believe by far the Bible would communicate to us, and I believe it's the position that we really should be holding if we're premillennial. I don't see any other system that would truly be able to withstand holding up to context, going through passages verse by verse, and not just kind of jumping around all over the place. Although I am for pulling in other scriptures to get insight into other scriptures, and that's a wonderful thing. But I believe the post-trib, pre-wrath position is the only one that can withstand the scrutiny that can be thrown against it, whether that's from a pre-trib position, a way post-trib position of saying that the second coming and the rapture happen at the end of the Daniel 70th week. I want to also say that if I were to change on this, from what I understand today, I would take a more traditional premillennial view where there's like one coming of Christ at the end of the 7 years and then the millennial reign. But I believe there is too much overwhelming information in the scripture that would make me say, hey, this cannot be the case because of very, very compelling reasons. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So just for reference here, what we'll do is I'm just going to show everybody really quick. This is Steven Anderson's chart here.
The Bible only says Great Tribulation, not the Great Tribulation. I know some folks like Brian Dellinger make a really big deal about that. I would just say for those who do call it the Great Tribulation, they only mean that just because it easily identifies that time frame. Whether or not you actually mean it lasting 75 days, 74 days, or 1,260 days, or 1,290 days, or whatever else you might call it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what I put the thing up there and the audio went out. So evidently I cannot take I can't just show here's what we can do, I think. Guys, forgive me. I'm trying to figure some of this out here. And it's not working out great. But anyway, so there, if you can see that timeline there, basically, hey, everybody do me a favor and like and share this, put this in like several Facebook groups and all that kind of stuff. I know this was an unannounced video, and gosh, our viewer count plummeted because I gommed it up, and there was like no audio there for some of that while you were talking. But
oh, really?
Basically, if everybody can see this, yeah, some of that, the 1,260 days, the orange part there, guys, if you can see that he says that wasn't specified out. I guess one of the biggest things I want to talk about and just make sure everybody clarifies, because when we say, or when you guys say post-trib, pre-wrath, rapture, in the minds of pre-tribbers, it's to us, it's a mid-trib rapture.
Yes.
And what you kind of have there with it is, if you guys can see on that timeline, I don't know how big it is on your guys' end. But you have the first little dots there at the top. So there's a row of dots at the top right under Daniel's 70th week. And the first, 5, 6 dots there, those are the sealed judgments that are mentioned in Revelation chapter 5 and chapter 6. And what post-trib, pre-wrath, what we would call mid-tribbers believe is that, and make sure you tell me if there's anything in here that you don't believe. They believe that the first 6 seals happen up to the middle point of Daniel's 70th week. And at the 6th seal, that the day of the Lord occurs and Jesus comes back and the rapture of the church takes place. Is that what you believe?
Yes, and I completely understand why you would call my position mid-trib. As long as we understand each other, what we call is not as important. So yes, if you believe that the whole 7 years, Daniel's 70th week, if you believe that entire period is in some way, whether you call it the tribulation or perhaps even the great tribulation, then my position saying that it happens in about the middle, I'm definitely mid-trib at that point. But of course, from the way I understand certain scriptures, because I would say Matthew 24, 29 through 31 is actually happening in the middle, not the very end of the 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I would say that I'm post-trib, pre-wrath, because I would view that terminology into a midpoint, not at the very end of the week.
Right. And so just so everybody knows, the 2 rows of dots there at the top of the chart, those are going to be your trumpet and your vial judgments. And what that is going to be is the second half of the 70th week. So a post-trib pre-wrather typically believes that the tribulation only lasts the first 3.5 years. Then at the middle point of Daniel's 70th week, the rapture of the church takes place. And then there is what's called the time of wrath, or the wrath period. And that's when the vials and the trumpets are judgments, which are found in Revelation, roughly 8 through 11, and then for the trumpets, and then 15 and 16 for the vials. That's when they're poured out. Now, let me ask you this also. Do you subscribe to the split view of Revelation where the chapters 1 through 11 are one view of Daniel's 70th week, and then 12 through 22 or whatever, technically 19, are the other view of Daniel's 70th week?
Yeah, great question. So I could say in a general sort of loose sense, yes, but at the end of the day, it does get more technical and complicated than just that.
Mm-hmm.
So because I do see certain parts, not being in full absolute chronological order. Even
So
like they're just like
that's
some
where you and
mentions
Anderson
even.
that's where you and Anderson would differ. You do not believe it's in strict chronological order.
It depends on what we're talking about. So certain things I do believe are in a definite chronological order, particularly when we deal with, well, it's not exactly Revelation 1 through 11, but I would say Revelation 6 through 9. That is what I would say is the absolute chronological order. Revelation 10, of course, is a bit of a parenthesis. I think probably even your position can agree with that, right? Where it just
parenthetical chapter. It's just kind of like a commentary on what. Yeah,
it goes into a different understanding. But although, of course, there is the mention of the seven thunders, which I'm sure if John was able to reveal what those said, we'd have even more insight.
mm-hmm.
Really interesting insight, I'm sure. But yeah, that chapter is a standalone, sort of isolated chapter in a sense. And then
So
Revelation 11. Yeah, go ahead.
So you would peg the rapture at Revelation 6, and then also peg it at so in one account of the 70th week, the 1 through 11, just for loose terms, you would put the rapture at chapter 6, like Anderson.
Well, here's the thing. Like, I can say yes to that, but I would say kind of not the rapture, but the result of the rapture is in Revelation 7. But it's at that point, it's so soon kind of related. I mean, it's only a matter of, I'm sure, like an hour or just a little more, something like that, of between Revelation 6 and 7 there.
Okay, so but you would definitely put the
But
exit of the church in Revelation 6.
yes, it would happen at basically after the opening of the sixth seal in Revelation 6. And then if you want to get really technical, the rapture is not in either Revelation 6 or 7, but because of what is described about the sixth seal, and then in chapter 7 about like the great multitude, I believe that absolutely means the rapture occurred then. It
That
just
occurred. Mm-hmm. And then in Revelation chapter 14, in the 12 through 19
uh-huh.
account, chapters 12 through 19, you would put the rapture of the church in Revelation 14.
Yeah, I do see the rapture in Revelation 14. That's correct.
Okay. All right. So with this, the day of the Lord, you would put the day of the Lord in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, correct? Because
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
technically what Anderson does is you would absolutely put the abomination of desolation in the middle.
yeah, and
I
I
think that's
think
pretty well across the board, like everybody believes that.
yeah, absolutely. That's that, when you're premillennial, it'd be very difficult to argue. If you believe in a 7-year period, right? I think it'd be very difficult for anyone to argue that the abomination did not occur in the middle. I mean,
Right.
that's so clear. Um, there's some people, I've seen that, okay, they believe in something kind of close to what I believe in, but they think there's only 3.5 years and not 7 years. But that's silly.
Mhm. So, and with I know that Anderson, if I'm remembering correctly from there on the chart, I think I'm going to hide the chart really quick because I think at this point we're done with it. We'll refer back to it if need be. But Anderson has the abomination of desolation happening in the middle, but then 75 days after the abomination of desolation, the day of the Lord occurring. Would you agree with that?
That's actually a point where I slightly differ from him. And then I also have kind of more explanation about what I would say in regards to the day of the Lord and what it entails. So I think technically the day of the Lord, you could say, begins on actually the day before he has it. But I think you can also say, I think it's only a matter of time zone, because what I think is that um, the day of the Lord, you could say, like I would say, particularly from Isaiah 13, that the day of the Lord is the very day where you have, the celestial events, the sun, moon being darkened, stars falling. But then
Mm.
in other accounts, particularly Joel chapter 2, which I'm sure we're going to get into for other reasons, that says the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before, that great and terrible day of the Lord come. If that wasn't the quote, is from Acts 2 of quoting Joel 2, or whichever one it was. But
Mhm.
um, and I've thought about, like, okay, why is it that in Joel 2 it says before the day of the Lord you have the celestial events, and then in like Isaiah 13, these events, I mean, when you read it, I mean, definitely seems like it's the very same day. I think that's just because of the time zone. I think the day that the sun, moon, and stars are darkened, and stars fall and all that, that's going to happen basically an hour before the stroke of midnight, or 12:01 or whatever in Israel time, and then like, if you could say Gentile standard time, it's the same day, like as far as their time zone.
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure that's obviously, we're not really here to talk about that point too much, but um, so for when Stephen Anderson has the rapture at the 1335th day, I can agree with that, but I would say technically the day of the Lord, you could say, begins on the 1334th day.
Okay.
But look at another time zone view, you could say it's the 1335th. But
Mhm. Okay.
um, and then
So go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, but if we put aside that technical point that I just made about the day before or the very day that Steve Anderson has in the chart, um, I believe that actually every day from the rapture, or from the celestial events through the end of the 70th week, that each individual day is a day of the Lord. not just like the midpoint of the 70th week. So I would say, but if I want to probably highlight certain days that are perhaps you could say are the most day of the Lord, I would say it's the day of the rapture and about the middle, and then at the very end, which I would say is happening in Revelation 19. So those would be the highlight day of the Lord's, if you will. But I do believe every day in between that is a day of the Lord.
I've never heard that before. Is that something unique to you, or do you know others that believe that?
I'm probably just about the only one, but I probably talked with some brethren who probably after I talked through them with that they might believe that, but no, there's no like go-to person to say, hey, this is what you believe. So if you will, for public record, I guess maybe I'm the first one to think of it like that, but
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, let's kind of dive in with it here. You know, I am pre-trib. I'm strongly dispensational. I'm more pre-trib because of my dispensationalism. A lot of guys, well, I'm pre-tribulational, so by default, I'm kind of dispensational. Well, no, I'm dispensational, therefore I am pre-trib. With the dispensational view of scriptures, of course, we divide strictly between and we don't have time to get into all of this, but we divide strictly between Jew, Gentile, and Church of God. 1 Corinthians 10:32. I believe there's three distinct groups of people on the earth. There's Jews, there's Gentiles, and there's saved people. And then I believe that the time of the tribulation or 70th week, whatever you want to call it, is for the Jew. I think the Old Testament scriptures bear that out. That is the time of Jacob's trouble. I don't ascribe to replacement theology, but when you look at, and I don't know, are you replacement do you believe in replacement theology?
Glad you asked about that. So this is actually a point where I would strongly differ from the new IFB in regards to what they think about Israel. So having said that, I do think they make some really good points about replacement theology that I think are true. That being said, as far as like their understanding of Romans 11, for example, I think is just horrible. Sorry, the Israel is going to be saved. That's that's a very major doctrine of the Old Testament. Romans 11 debunks the view that they commonly say about it. Like you had an interview with Tommy McMurtry on that.
Yeah.
Sorry, you destroyed him on that point.
Well, and I listened to Tommy McMurtry's message. He preached on it. I think it was a message, maybe in video. I can't remember. It was long ago. Yeah, they horribly butcher Romans 11. The only people that do Romans 11 like that are the followers, whatever you want to call them, the new IFBs, people who follow Stephen Anderson. It is a horrendous exegesis of Romans 11. But anyway, so that's good that you are not replacement theology, because me and you both know a lot of guys who take, quote unquote mid-trib or true, I call it true post-trib position, post 70th week, typically are replacement theology, believers.
Yeah. Yeah. And then some. Yeah. Go ahead.
No. Go. You go ahead. It's fine.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, somebody who I would strongly disagree with on salvation, but who does basically have a Stephen Anderson type of view on the rapture and yet differs on him to some extent on replacement theology would be actually Jason Cooley, if you know who that is. So he's probably a guy that he would recognize at some points, like the new IP saying, pointing out the scriptures they do about basically, the church being Israel, if you will. And I can agree with a lot of the new IP on that, but where I think they, again, do the horrible point is thinking that, physical Israel is not going to be saved in the last days, that God's just, completely done with them. That's not the case. That's just you can very easily demonstrate from Romans 11 that they're wrong on that. And from a lot of other passages in the scripture, like in Zechariah.
Right. Yeah. Zechariah is a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. That. And if I can also make this point, because for anyone who's listening, I do believe in there will be sacrifices in the millennium. animal sacrifices.
You know, that's I know we're not discussing this, but I do think it's interesting. You believe that
Yeah,
the new IFB. I'm not really even sure what they do with those passages
they
about that because it
spiritualize
is
them.
very, very
You know,
clear. Oh, do they? Okay.
I mean,
They would just not
I've
have
seen
to.
yeah, or they spiritualize it, or they say, "Oh, these things actually took place in the past."
Really. And I guess
Yeah,
this is kind of where, you know, just to be honest, this is kind of where us pre-tribbers, because pre-tribbers take the Bible as literally as possible, as much as possible. And I guess this is kind of where a lot of the new IFB, a lot of guys who hold your position, maybe the reason why they don't want to discuss with us, because I don't know what exactly it is. You know, they say it's because we're all lost and reprobates. You know, that's the reason why they don't, you know, have any of these discussion with us. But of course, I was born at night, but it wasn't last night. So I know that there's an alternative, you know, another reason, an alternative motive. But there's so many passages when you're dealing with Israel and when you're dealing with the coming of the Lord that they just simply spiritualize, or they do mental gymnastics to get around. And that's what's so frustrating to a lot of us pre-trib guys, if that makes sense.
absolutely. I mean, the problem is, whenever you take a position, like it's wonderful to take a position, especially one that's right. But what I want to do when I approach the scripture is, I first, you could say, even before I start with it, is to say, okay, I just want to know God's truth. Whatever that is, I want to know it. I don't want to have to force myself into, thinking a certain way about the scripture because I was told that. I want to be able to prove all things from the Bible itself. And
Sure.
and when it comes to what I believe about the rapture, I just saw, what Steven Anderson was teaching about the rapture was, I could not, I, yes, I did find fault at some points, but overall, what he was teaching on it, I was just like, yeah, this is what I see the Bible's teaching.
Sure.
That's the
Well,
best
let's do this.
explanation.
Let's dig in and let's have some fun now. Let's kind of dig in. Let's get over into Revelation. Let's get into what everybody is tuned in for. Let's start looking at the specifics about the differences of what you believe and what I believe here.
Sure.
Let's just start out in Revelation chapter 6. I think that's a good starting point here. And so you would have this,
Sure.
and I think it's interesting the way you described it, not necessarily the rapture of the church, but kind of the result, I guess, of the rapture of the church. But you would agree that the rapture of the church happens in the same time frame of
Yeah.
Revelation 6.
Yes, because Revelation 6, I mean, I'm sure you even agree, is a full parallel to Matthew 24. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think the seals in Matthew 24 and all that, I think they line up very well.
Yeah. And that's what the new IFB believes. And,
Mhm.
they just go through it verse by verse, and it's like, oh, yeah, of course it is that way. Um, uh, in Revelation 6, again, specifically the rapture, you're really only going to find that in the most clearest of terms, I would say, in 1 Thessalonians 4,
Mhm.
because the mention of caught up. And in the Latin, I guess that's rapturo or whatever it is, which is, where we get
Yeah,
our word rapture.
right. It's
Um,
not a Bible word.
yeah, that's like the rapture, but of course, highly related to that is 1 Corinthians 15. So that those are, you could say, your quick rapture passages.
Mhm.
And then, of course, I believe those are, well, Matthew 24 is speaking of those events, and then Revelation 6 being parallel to Matthew 24, and that's how I bring the rapture into it, even though it's specifically not in Revelation 6. But
Right. Now here is, and I'm sure you've seen my videos and stuff, and you of course watched the conversation I had with Tommy McMurtry.
mhm.
Kind of, well, not kind of, like the biggest problem I had is I have the day of the Lord, from my understanding of the scriptures, happening at the end of the 70th week and not a day before.
Yeah.
And the what I point to with that is that when you read Revelation chapter 6 and when you read Revelation chapter 11, because according to the Stephen Anderson mid-trib, post-trib, pre-wrath timeline, Revelation 6 is the rapture, Revelation 11 is the end of the 70th week. And then
Yeah.
in Revelation 14, in the second account, you have Revelation 14 as the rapture and Revelation 19 as the end of the 70th week. So
Yeah.
what I see, though, is I see so many parallels, and I think they're plain as day. I think there are 5 accounts of the day of the Lord in Revelation. I think that Revelation 6 is an account of the day of the Lord. I think that Revelation 11 is an account of the day of the Lord. I think Revelation 14 is an account of the day of the Lord. I think Revelation 16 is an account of the day of the Lord. And I believe that Revelation 19 is an account of the day of the Lord. And the similarities between all those passages are extremely overwhelming. Let me just point out one just to kind of get us, started off with it. Revelation chapter 6 and verse number 12, it says that there was a great earthquake that happened at the opening of the 6th seal. But we also find the exact same phrase, a great earthquake, occurring in Revelation 11:13. And we also find it in Revelation 16:18, when we also go back to Joel chapter 2 and Isaiah chapter 2, we find earthquakes an earthquake happens in all of those passages. So would you just say that there is an earthquake that happens in the middle and at the end?
Yes.
Okay. Also, the sun becomes black as sackcloth of hair and the moon becomes as blood. You would say that happens in the middle, not the end.
I believe it happens at both,
At
actually.
both. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And by the way, if I can just explain why I think that, specifically in Revelation, as far as I'm aware, any well, I shouldn't say not all celestial references, but much of the celestial references, maybe it really is only Revelation 6 where I could point that out in a certain way in Revelation. But the reason I would say there's also a darkening of the sun and moon and stars is because of actually Joel chapter 3. I see that as Armageddon.
Joel 3?
Yeah.
I do too. Do you see? But you see Joel 2 as the. Okay, so what do you see Joel 2 as?
I see Joel 2 as a lot of things, actually. So the locust, I see that as, Revelation 9, and I know you have your reasons for thinking it's not that. And then I also see Joel 2 as dealing with the events of Revelation 6. One quick reason I could say I believe that is because if you look at the terms, I think it's blood and moon in the King James. In fact, let me just look it up on Bible Gateway here. I think those are only mentioned. Yeah, if you look for blood, comma moon, that's only mentioned 3 times in the King James. So that's in Joel 2, Acts 20, or excuse me, Acts 2:20, which is quoting Joel 2, and then in Revelation 6. So I definitely see the mention of the 6th seal as being Joel 2. I mean, it's
Right.
just because of the terminology. Yeah.
So let me ask you this, about Joel 2, because that is a very tough chapter, in my opinion, for a lot of the post-trib pre-wrathers. In Joel 2, you have, let me see if I can find where the earthquake. Yeah, verse number 10. So Joel 2:10 about the earthquake. So there's the earthquake. The earth shall quake before them. The heavens shall tremble. The sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. So you would say that would be Joel chapter, or excuse me, you'd say that would be the rapture.
Actually, for that particular part in Joel 2, I would say no, although I can certainly see why the new IFB brethren would do that.
So you would put it at the end of the 70th week.
No, actually, let me just go here to the full chapter. I see this chapter as a bit more segmented. So I would probably say from Joel 2:1 through at least verse 14. Well, actually, 12 through 14 is kind of more addressed for Israel, but I would say at least verses 1 through 11 is dealing with Revelation 9. Again, 12 through 14 is kind of addressing Israel.
So you don't believe that Joel 2 verses 1 through 11 are dealing with the day of the Lord?
No, I do. Again, I believe that every day from the rapture, like basically the second half of the 70th week, that each individual day there is a day of the Lord. So, and
So
I actually get
the
that in
moon
part
and
because of
star.
this passage.
So
Yeah, go
the
ahead.
moon, the sun, moon, and stars withdraw their shining and all that. You think that happens in Revelation 9 when the locusts are released?
I believe there are multiple occurrences of the celestial events.
So
So,
the sun, moon,
yeah,
so the sun and the moon, so they're darkened and then they come back on.
yes, and part of the like probably maybe a more clear reason would I'd have to go to the Book of Revelation. So, like in Revelation 8, that has similar things happening, but just on a different level. Um, it's probably some of the first few of the trumpets there, like a little bit less severe than they are in actually Revelation 6.
So do you? Okay, so you have to forgive me because I've never heard this before.
Sure, I'm sure.
I had a feeling we may get into stuff I've never heard, but this is some
Uh-huh.
uncharted territory. So, okay, so number one, we've got every day after the middle point being the day of the Lord,
Yes, yes.
and we have
Well,
the sun.
a day of the Lord.
Okay,
But you
a
could
day.
say,
So when is
yeah,
so when is the day of the Lord?
there's again, like I was saying earlier, there's like the highlight day of the Lord's. So the day of the rapture for me in the midweek, and then at the very end for Armageddon.
So
The,
those are
the
the days of the Lord.
yeah, you could say it that way, sure.
You see where I maybe struggle a little bit with that.
Yes, but you
Okay,
know what?
but
I can actually we can go to another passage that I think will help kind of establish that a little bit more because
okay, well let's look here at Joel 2 and 3. I will be more than glad to move on, but I do because
I don't know.
this is
Let's stay on it. Whatever.
because this is where we kind of kind of us guys who are my tribe will kind of hang our hats a little bit, but we will move on. I promise. We're not having Sunday school tomorrow because of the coronavirus, so I can stay up later. I can stay up an hour later than usual. Anyway, because you have in verse number 11 as well, and the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his
Right.
camp is very great, for he is strong that executeth his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible, and who can abide it?
Hmm.
So the question is like, who can abide this? The
Yeah.
obvious answer is no one, which would be
Hmm.
a perfect cross reference to Revelation 6. Revelation chapter 6
Yeah.
and verse number 16, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? So you don't see those two as a parallel there?
I can certainly see why you make the connection. Like, of course, I'd have to admit the language similarities and all that. The reason why I think this is different is actually because I believe the description of the army is just uncannily similar to Revelation 9, which is again from my perspective it happens well after the sixth seal.
So do you think
So,
the Lord comes down and leads this army in Revelation 9?
oh, that's a good question. So I actually see. I'd have to look at a certain verse. I don't actually see Joel 2, at least 1 through 11, dealing with a coming of the Lord down to the earth or down to the clouds or something like that. I see this as a bit more of a kind of guidance of the army. Perhaps, or actually, yeah, I would probably say invisibly at this particular time.
Um, what would you do with verse number 11? And the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for
Uh
his
huh.
for his camp is very strong, for he is strong that executeth his word.
Okay.
You don't see that as the Lord leading that army there.
No, he absolutely is leading the army. In this case, because again, I connect this with Revelation 9. I would see the Lord utters his voice before his army, but he's invisible at this particular time. Is what I mean. Even if he's not invisible, I still would say this is parallel to Revelation 9 at the fifth trumpet judgment.
Whoop, dropping my pen. Okay, and so obviously this throws a huge, wrench in the
Oh,
works for the Anderson guys, because if
uh-huh.
we'll bring the thing back up here, they have, if you guys can see that, they have no, I want this one to be big. Come on now, work with me. Anyway, I'm not gonna be able to do it. Let's see here.
Can I actually? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, so the Anderson guys, if you guys can see that, I wish that I wasn't the one that was taking the big part of the frame. But anyway, I don't know how to get that fixed. But they have the fifth. So they'll say that Joel chapter 2 is talking about the locust of Revelation 9. But what they also say is, well, this is talking about the day of the Lord. So it throws it's like a blatant contradiction in what they're saying, because the locusts don't get released at the day of the Lord. They get released well after the day of the Lord at the fifth trumpet, which would happen well after the church is supposed to be gone. So it's a huge contradiction in the timeline of Stephen Anderson for them to say that the day of the Lord and then these locusts are revealed and all that kind of stuff. They cannot make sense of it at all. But let me ask you this about Joel chapter 2. With that, verse number 9, they shall enter in at the windows like a thief. Of course, the cross reference over there would be Jesus coming at the oh, I'm sorry. Hang on. I don't want to get that yet. The Lord leading. The Lord is leading.
I know where you're going with that. I know where you're going.
Yeah, I'm losing my train of thought here. Hang on a second. So the Lord is leading this army, obviously, but when you get to Revelation 9, it's quite obvious that God is not leading this army. They come out of the bottomless pit, and the king that is leading them in Revelation 9:11 is Abaddon, or his Greek name Apollyon.
Okay.
Which is the angel of the bottomless pit, not the Lord.
So my answer to that would be the Lord is over that army and that particular angel. This is his army. This isn't a good army. This is a bad army. But the Lord, it's his army because he created it. He's in control of it.
So
yeah.
So with that, it's so he's leading this army, and the king of the bottomless pit is following the Lord in Revelation 9.
Yeah. So this is where I'm sure the new IFB is going to have a huge disagreement, but I believe that God controls everything that happens. That everything that happens is the will of God. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that for instance, when people sin, they're not doing the perfect will of God. But I do believe that at the end of the day, God is controlling everything that happens. So it's God owns everything. Heaven is his throne, earth is his footstool. The Lord reigns over everything. It's his army. He created it. That's why he can utter his voice before it.
Okay. With all that as well, you have the army in Joel 9, or Joel chapter 2, verse number 9. They shall enter at the windows like a thief. So they're coming like a thief, which is, of course, a direct cross reference to Revelation 16:15, where Jesus and his army come like a thief at Armageddon, not at the fifth seal.
So for me, again, because I view Joel 2, 1 through 11 as where it is in Revelation 9, I just see this as a completely different event. So, when they're entering in at windows like a thief, that's this particular locust army doing that. It's not the Lord's army coming with his saints in Revelation 19. And if I can also say, one of the reasons I actually conclude that from the rapture to the end of the 70th week, why each individual day there is the day of the Lord is actually because of, in part, hugely Joel 2 here. because again, I see the parallel from Joel 2 to Revelation 9. And then what does Joel 2 clearly say here? This is taking place on the day of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So because I see that as different from the sixth seal, because of Revelation 9, I therefore conclude, because every day after that is the day of God's wrath, and the day of the Lord and God's wrath are just intertwined so much that I conclude that they're all days of the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me ask you this thing in Joel chapter 2, and maybe even going into Joel 3. So you would say that like Joel 2:31 and 32, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come.
Mm-hmm.
That's which day of the Lord is that?
Well, I actually think perhaps it's applicable to both of mine, but I would say at least primarily this is dealing with Revelation 6 because of what I said earlier about if you look up moon and blood, only 3 verses in the Bible refer to that. And that's Joel 2, Acts 2, and Revelation 6 at the sixth seal.
Okay, let's get to Joel 3.
Sure.
Here we'll move on to Joel 3. Now you would say this is the battle of Armageddon.
Yeah, I would say because of we calls out the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Again, I don't have all the references down for how to connect that, but I'm fairly certain that that is maybe another way of saying Armageddon as another term for it, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would see this as, and even just a valley, the Valley of Armageddon, or Megiddo. So,
Mm-hmm. So in here, you have
and go ahead. Sorry.
well, no, you have Joel chapter 3 and verse number 13. And again, just so everybody kind of knows where I'm coming from with dealing with all this, I think that Joel 2, Joel 3, Isaiah 2, Isaiah 13, Revelation 6, 11, 14, 16, and 19 are all talking about, Matthew 24, 31 are all talking about the day of the Lord. And I think that is a singular event that lasts 1,000 years. I say that's almost contradictory. It's an event that lasts 1,000 years, but it starts on a particular day, and that's the day of the Battle of Armageddon. So I'm just trying to kind of pull out where I
Sure.
see the similarities and just trying to get your view on them. So Joel chapter 3 and verse number 13, put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, get you down, for the press is full, the fats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. So you would have that as the Battle of Armageddon.
I would, yes.
Okay, now let me ask you this, and this is another place where I've never really had anybody been able to answer me. If you flip over Revelation 14, which I know is where you put the rapture in the middle, the cross reference is pretty clear. Revelation chapter 14 and verse number 14. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. So there's that. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time has come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. That's exactly what was said in Joel 3:13. And he puts in his sickle and he reaps, and then he puts it in again, and he gathers those into the winepress of the wrath of God, and the winepress is trampled out. Explain how you reconcile that with Revelation 14 being in the middle, but Joel 3 being at the end.
Yeah, I would say Revelation 14 perhaps goes back and forth as to what events are talked about. But nevertheless, I would say that for these particular kind of harvest gatherings, I actually see 2 of them in Revelation 14. So this particular harvest, I would say that this is at the day of the rapture, where the wicked are being judged after the righteous are raptured and resurrected. And then there's the other gathering that takes place here in Revelation 14. I would see that as the rapture. Have you heard Stephen Anderson talk about that before? Noticing the 2 harvests that happen here?
I definitely believe that there are 2 harvests here. I think there's the harvest of the righteous, and then I think there's a harvest of the wicked. I for sure, I've never heard Stephen Anderson talk about that, but I definitely believe that.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's no. I'm sorry. Actually, Okay, so I'm sorry. Maybe what I was calling the wicked, that actually might be the righteous from what I'm seeing.
So the first harvest here
Yeah, that one's
is
good, right? And then the second one that's
it's the
negative.
second one that's bad. The first one is good, and the second one is bad. That's when he gathers those into the wine press
Yeah,
of the wrath of God.
sure. Another thing I think is worth pointing out is another passage that would come to mind for something like this, of course, is Matthew 13, right, where you have another harvest. But what happens there? You have the wicked first gathered, and then the righteous.
Yeah,
And
because
I
that's at
actually,
the end of the world. That's at the end of the millennial kingdom.
I could see why you say that. Personally, I do see that as actually, um,
You see that as a rapture passage?
no, 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 no,
Oh.
not a rapture passage. Um, if I'm remembering correctly, I think I would be placing that at the end of the 70th week, and then Revelation 14 as at the middle. And actually, because you have the reversal of the order there, I think that's part of the reason why I've come to that conclusion. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so that's interesting. So you think that Matthew 13 is referring to the
Yeah.
second
This.
advent.
Yeah. For you, this you call that the second habit. For me, and then this is another place where I would diverge a little bit from what the new IFB says. So I believe that there's clearly, and these things should be called the second coming and then the third coming. They kind of distance themselves from the term third coming. They'll admit
Mhm.
it if they get down to it, but they're not really comfortable with it. I'm completely comfortable with it, and I think we should use that terminology.
Okay.
And yeah,
So I definitely want to get back. So let's like put a quick timeout because again, you're throwing stuff at me. I just gotta
sure.
I gotta process it. We're getting back to Revelation 14. We're calling a quick timeout though to go to Matthew 13. Okay. Um. Okay. Matthew
Go
Matthew
ahead.
13:36. Then
Okay.
Jesus sent the multitude away. So okay, and the reason why we're going here is because you say that
Yeah.
because of the reversal, because in
Hmm.
Revelation 14, it's the righteous first, then the wicked. And I
Right.
agree with that. But you have that as the rapture.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a 3.5 year gap in between the first and the second reaping in Revelation 14?
No, no, no. I would say in Revelation 14 that
It's all
that's all
one
happening
event.
on the same day.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, then, okay. Then that's been lost. All right. We'll go back to that then. Matthew 13. And so you would say this is at the end, the third advent or third coming, as you would say. But the battle of
Yeah.
Armageddon. So let me ask you this: Matthew 13:36. Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came into him, saying, Declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said unto them, verse 37, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom.
Hmm.
Do you think there's children of the kingdom in the tribulation period?
Children of the well, again, I believe that there will be saints even after the rapture, at least
Mm-hmm.
144,000. And I think they
Right.
will get other people saved. Because I see the 144,000 as starting their ministry during the second half, along with the two witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I do as
if
well.
Yeah.
But but how can there be children of the kingdom if the kingdom isn't set up yet?
So how would I answer this here? Okay, yeah. So, for instance, like what I believe at the third coming. So you have Christ with his saints coming down, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's, for instance, those are the children of the kingdom. For example, it's all God's saints.
So the people coming with Christ are the children of the kingdom.
Yeah, they have. Yeah, I would say absolutely. And then not only that, because I believe the day that Christ is going to come back, you're going to have all Israel be saved on that day. So you will have actual, flesh and blood, kind of normal human beings on the earth that are saved as well during that time.
Well, okay. Well, if you look at the passage, it says,
Hmm.
But the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that
Okay.
sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world,
Okay.
and the reapers are the angels.
Okay.
As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all
Yep.
things that offend and them which do iniquity. There's no kingdom at the 70th week. It's set up then, but there's no kingdom to gather out the wicked ones. And
Okay.
it's also not in the end of the 70th week is not the end of the world.
Okay. I mean, in regards to like the end of the world, there's multiple ways I think the Bible uses that term. I would point you, of course, that there's some parallel to like Matthew 24. Not saying is this particular event is, like 20 versus Matthew 24, 29 through 31, but just like in that passage, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? It doesn't necessarily mean the absolute, total destruction of the earth. It's just in general, the end of the world. There's going to be an end to something in how the world has gone. Like a new age, if we can use that term, a different age. And then also in Matthew 13 about the kingdom. So because of Revelation 11, where it says the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So I actually believe that the kingdom, that isn't actually on Armageddon. That's actually a little bit before that. I not necessarily remembering all the reasons why I've come to that conclusion.
So you
I
think
think it's some. Go ahead.
you think the kingdom is set up before Armageddon?
No. So what I would say is that the kingdom, like even here in Matthew 13, the field is the world. Um, the good seed are the children of the kingdom. I thought there was another reference here to about kind of the world and the kingdom. I think it's in here somewhere. Well, even if it's not what I thought it was here. Oh, yeah. It's actually verse 41, more like the Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I believe is that during the 70th week, you could say the vast majority of that time, it is the Antichrist kingdom and has Satan's kingdom. I believe that. But then I believe that in Revelation 11, God just declares it's now mine. The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. So that proclamation is made before Armageddon. It's a number of days before that. And then
Really?
at Armageddon, it is like the full establishment. So that's how I would see that. So it's his, and by the way, I really believe right now the world is God's kingdom. He reigns over it, but yet at the same time, they are going to become his kingdoms.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
No. No. So when so when Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth, why would
Yeah,
he show them if they were already his?
that's a great question. So there's a simultaneous teaching in the Bible that God is the king right now, and there's also a teaching that he's going to reign over it. He's yet to reign over it.
Yeah, and see,
So
that's where I don't know if you know, like the dispensational view of the difference between the kingdom of God and kingdom of heaven.
I've certainly heard what you guys have said about it. I
Yeah.
believe. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I know. I was just commenting. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe the best explanation of that is the kingdom of heaven is the kingdom of God. There are some possibilities for, like thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So I would probably say that even though there's the kingdom of heaven, there is sort of a bringing it down to earth in a way. But I would say that at the end of the day, those terms are parallel. But if it's the kingdom of God, it's therefore the kingdom of heaven, and
Mhm.
vice versa.
Okay. Again, we're in uncharted territory. Again, I've never heard this stuff. Um. Uh, anyway, okay. All right. Well, that was a rabbit that we faced. Okay. So you can see though we kind of discussed. Okay. So you think that second advent, the kingdoms of the world, Do you think
Mhm.
Satan? You believe Satan's the god of this world, right?
Yes,
Okay. How could he be god of the world but not also be king of the world?
he is. There's
Okay.
just another king above him.
Okay. All right. All right. We'll move on. Let's go back to let's go back to Revelation 14. So Revelation 14:19. So you clarified that you believe that there's two reapings here. There's
Yeah.
the righteous being reaped first, and then there's the wicked being reaped second, which I agree with. But you would say that this is not in any way referencing the Battle of Armageddon.
That's a kind of a tough question. So, of course, like you bring out about Joel 3 and like the harvest and reaping. Of course, I understand why you would connect that with Revelation 14. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's self evident. Um, I would even say that like the first coming of Christ, for example, it pictures the second coming, and you could even say the second coming pictures the third coming. So I think all these things are related to a point, but specifically the event here in the harvest, I would say that's different from like Joel 3 at this particular time. But you could say it's much of the terminology here could apply to the harvest in Joel 3, of course.
Okay, because you have the blood that runs out up to the horse
Hmm.
bridle,
Yes.
and you think you don't spiritualize that passage. You think it's literal.
Yes.
And what do you think? I mean, what causes that? Because you have
Yeah. Because there's a parallel between this and Revelation 19, the winepress of the wrath of God, right?
right. So I guess Revelation 14:19 and 20, Revelation chapter 14, verses 19 and 20. Where does that happen, and how does that happen?
I'm sorry, I I was slightly confusing exactly what you were talking about. Can you repeat the question again?
Oh, that's fine. Revelation chapter 14,
Right.
verse number 19 and 20.
Okay.
You would put this as a rapture passage, kind of like the day of the Lord starting off, the first one, the rapture, the
Yeah.
wrath of God beginning. The blood coming out and going up to the horse's bridle, the wine press. Where does that happen and when? Or I'm sorry, not when, where?
That's a good question. I mean, if I were just to look at Revelation 14, I mean, a possible answer could be Babylon, because of what's said earlier in the passage. That's a location. But from your perspective, you would say that's, you know, either in the Valley of Armageddon or, somewhere around Jerusalem, something like that, right?
Armageddon. Yeah, Jehoshaphat, Megiddo. Yeah.
Yeah. I absolutely see why you come to that conclusion.
So is it the Lord stamping out the wine press there?
Uh,
Because the wine press was trodden without
yeah,
the city. Who's trotting there?
I could certainly. I wouldn't have a problem saying it's God that's doing that. I would just wouldn't necessarily put it as Armageddon.
So in Revelation 19, in verse 15, when he says that he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God, you
Hmm.
would just say that there's two different wine presses and two different trottings?
I don't necessarily know if it's the different wine press. I would just say two different trottings. Probably is a way to say that. Yeah.
But you wouldn't connect Joel 3, Revelation 14, and Revelation 19.
I would connect Joel 3 with Revelation 19. Like I would, well, if I look at it from another perspective, I could connect all of these three, but again, I just see the timing is different.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So,
Um,
in other words, with my position, I do have a number of things that happen more than once. I admit that.
mhm. Okay. Well, it's an interesting view for sure.
Absolutely,
um,
absolutely.
okay. There was another place I was wondering. Oh, because you have passage. Okay, like Isaiah 63. Let me ask you about Isaiah 63.
Okay. Not sure where you were going with that one, so we'll see here.
Okay. It's kind of one tucked away. For most people, it's kind of where the pages will stick together. But anyway, So Isaiah 63, who is that? Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat? I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me, for I will tread them in mine anger, and trample them in my fury, and their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment. For the day of vengeance is in mine heart, and the year of my recompense, or excuse me, the year of my redeemed is come.
Mm-hmm.
So what?
Yeah.
When would you say? When would you say that happens?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I would see this as applicable to both, the second coming and the third coming, but probably a little bit more of the third coming, I'd be honest. Yeah, even when I look at my cross references, it references Revelation 19. So
So do
I
you
don't know. Oh, it actually brings up Revelation 14 in my cross reference too.
Yeah. One of the So here's the thing, because the day of the vengeance starts at the middle, right?
Yeah, I mean there's a starting of a day of the Lord in the middle. Yeah.
I thought that was the day of the Lord.
Yeah, you could say it is the day of the Lord. I just believe there are other days that are called the day of the Lord.
So when does the day of vengeance start? Like when can we say this is the day of vengeance?
Well, like Revelation 6, if I think does that have that term in it? The sixth seal? Well,
I don't.
Maybe it doesn't have that, but they're saying
vengeance. No,
for the great day of his wrath is come.
Wrath, yeah.
Yeah.
So because it clearly says, "For the day of vengeance is in mine heart."
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
So is this middle or end?
First glance here, I would prefer it being the third coming. But nevertheless, if my understanding of Revelation 14 is correct, I mean there's happening of this twice. And again, I already believe in, multiple celestial events happening at the second coming and then the third coming. So
right. So you think Jesus actually comes to the earth twice?
Well, he comes to the clouds at the second coming, and then at the third coming, he will actually touch the earth.
Well, he's got to touch it at the second too, according to what you believe. If you believe Revelation 14 is he's trotting out the winepress.
I guess I don't necessarily see that as like having to touch the earth per se. I think it could be done a little bit differently than that, but exactly how I don't necessarily know how to answer that. But like, okay, well, maybe this will help you out a little bit. So there is a wine press, but I would say it's spiritual, but I would say it's literally spiritual. Just in the same way that Paul says there is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. That's not some metaphorical concept. That's a real thing. I would say that the same thing about Revelation 14. It's literally happening, but just not necessarily in a typical kind of way. If you were just to go into an earth wine press, if that makes any sense. So a kind of an invisible wine press that might be visibly manifested at that time. If that makes any sense.
Is that your final no? Okay.
Because if you really do take like this literally, like the wine press, I mean, doesn't that, like, I don't think that's just some wine press in Jerusalem, for example. I think it's kind of like all the wicked are being, it gives a sense that all the wicked
are being gathered, and they're being stamped. I do believe they're being trodden down. I mean, I mean, the Bible is clear. There's going to be blood sprinkled on his garment. His garments are going to be dyed with the blood of men. The Bible talks about over there in Psalms. I can't remember specifically, but we wash our feet in the blood of men. The armies of the second advent, or well, in what you would call the third advent, we're washing our feet in their blood. So I think there's literally blood running up to the horse's bridle. I just,
Absolutely, absolutely.
I guess so that has to happen literally in Revelation 14. I just don't know how the Lord accomplishes that without touching the earth.
Yeah, I again, if you view it as Revelation 19, then yeah, that
Well, I'm
would
talking
be
about
an
Revelation
explanation of it.
14.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, but if you tie it in with Revelation 19, then absolutely he touches the earth, right?
yeah. Um,
So let me also say this: if my position on, because I still would stand by there's the gathering of the righteous and then the gathering of the wicked in Revelation 14 is happening
mhm,
on the day of the rapture. But if for some reason I'm incorrect about that, then my position would be the first gathering that's happening on the day of the rapture, the second coming, and then this other gathering would happen at the third coming. If it somehow I am required to do that, then that would be how I would understand it. But
okay.
it's my backup position, not my primary.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, I've been talking. I've kind of been on the question side, asking you questions
Oh,
for a
this is
little
good.
over for about an hour. We kind of had like 10 minutes, just kind of opening up. Let's kind of turn the tables a little bit. Is there any talking points you want to reference or questions you want to ask? A pre-tribber. I'm going to let you feel free to kind of take that lead there.
Okay, where to start? Right, there's so many. Um, so I guess could you explain a little bit more why you're pre-trib and uh, like at the end of the day, what would you have as kind of your crux of why you have to be pre-trib?
Yeah. So one of the biggest reasons that I'm pre-trib is actually because of the timing of the day of the Lord.
Hmm.
I think that the scripture is super clear that the day of the Lord begins at the Battle of Armageddon. I think that all of these are I think there are way too many similarities to say they're different events. I think that the day of the Lord is a 1,000-year period. If you look at 2 Peter 3:10, it talks about the day of the Lord when all the elements pass away, the heavens and earth pass away. There's a new heaven and a new earth. That's 2 Peter 3, verses 10 through 12. That's obviously a reference at the end of the millennial kingdom. So I think the day of the Lord begins at the Battle of Armageddon, and it goes until the Battle of Gog and Magog, Revelation chapter 20, when the old heavens and earth pass away and the new heavens and earth come into play. Well, interestingly enough, that period of time is 1,000 years. If
Yep.
you bump up to 2 Peter 3:8, just two verses before the reference to the day of the Lord there, it says that that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day. So I think the day of the Lord is a 1,000-year time period.
Yeah.
I think to make it, 1,003.5 or 1,007, because I know some pre-tribbers that make the whole 70th week part of the day of the Lord. I think that that's just wrong. I don't agree with any of that. I think it's 1,000 years. So because of that, I 100% agree that the wrath things pick up after the middle point, right? I think everybody
Yeah.
agrees with that. Things pick up, and I think that the wrath of God is apparent all the way through the 70th week, but especially the last 3.5 years. So we can't be here for that. Okay, we cannot be here for any of the wrath, and so I do not believe the day of the Lord happens in the middle. I believe it happens at the end. So my whole thing has been we're either going through all of it or none of it. And because I don't believe we'll be here for any of the wrath, I put it at one of the reasons that I put it in the beginning, because I think we're out of here at the beginning because we can't go through any of it. We can't get out on the day of the Lord, so we have to get out prior to it. I'm also dispensational. So I believe that
Yeah.
the 70th week applies to the Jew. It's a time when God's dealing with them, has nothing to do with the body of Christ or the church, and we're out of here. Also, my dispensationalism, I think there's some different doctrinal stuff going on that deals with eternal security, the workings of the Holy Ghost, the preaching of the gospel, and all that changes after the rapture. We obviously see, in my opinion, I think it's very clear. Even the layout of the New Testament is in a dispensational pre-trib layout. You have the Jews, the gospel of the kingdom and all that being preached in the gospels, the transition in Acts, then the Pauline epistles, the primary spokesman of the church, at Romans through Philemon, then boom, you kick off right after the Pauline epistles are done with Hebrews, James, which was written to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, 1st, 2nd Peter, apostle to the Jews, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. So I think that there's just a lot of things that point to the fact that the church is not here during the tribulation period or 70th week. We'll leave it at that. There's more I could go on, but I don't want to, do a whole bunch of the talking. But anyway, those are just a few reasons.
Yeah. I mean, basically, the crux of pre-trib is saying the whole Daniel 70th week is the wrath of God, and if that is that way, then yeah, I would say pre-trib definitely has a very strong argument and really should be believed at that point. I think one of the things that the new IFB would say about Revelation 6 about the seals is they're a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of the Lamb opening them.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm just like, no. It's absolutely the Lamb all the way. These aren't like man-made events. These are God-caused events.
Yeah, they would say, one of the things they would say, I'll interrupt you really quick, is, well, that's not the wrath of God, that's the wrath of Satan. And I always say, well, that's honestly not what they say. And I'll be like, well, it's the Lamb opening them,
Well, I know where you're going with that, but I would say at the same time, God is able to open a seal and then as part of that have the devil be furious toward certain people, like for example, which I think would be the case through deduction, for example. But no, God's absolutely the one who's causing these seals and events. But part of the reason that I'm not afraid to say that the rapture doesn't occur, or has to occur before this, is actually in part because of Revelation. Well, it is Revelation 6, but it's at the 5th seal. What's said there, and it's like, despite everything horrific that's already happened in Revelation 6 up to this point, it just makes a startling statement, really. So in verse 9, and when he had opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held, and they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? I'm not sure if you've heard or fully understood what has been said about this, but what we're seeing is here the saints of God, they're saying, God, you haven't judged, you haven't avenged our blood on them that dwell on the earth, and yet he's done all these things, huge things before that. But I would just say there's kind of like a change in focus, and things that happen like from the 6th seal onward, at that point. So even though these things are really bad to happen, I see them, like particularly the seals 1 through 4, I would see them as a bit more general judgments. Like they mean absolutely what they say here from the text. Of course, you have death and hell unleashed, for example, but I would see this as more general versus from the 6th seal onward. It's like absolute heavy, like unrestrained wrath upon the wicked at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Versus before this, I see it as a little bit more loose from that. So it's really startling when you think about it, that God's already done, unleashed death and hell, and these huge portions of the earth have died, and yet the saints are saying, God, you haven't judged and you haven't avenged our blood.
So when do you think he avenges the blood?
From the 6th seal onward, and even more specifically, it would be actually after the 6th seal, but particularly with trumpet judgments. But I would say, yes, Revelation's at the 6th seal. Like, yes, that is, you could say, the beginning of it.
The beginning of the avenging.
Yeah, because it is the day of the vengeance of our God at this, at the opening of the 6th seal.
Okay.
When God's shaking the earth, that is his vengeance. Yep.
Okay.
And by the way, the saints will endure that part, I believe. It's just that they're going to soon be raptured after that. God's going to protect them during that time, that brief period of time on that day where he shakes the earth and the heavens.
So what part? Okay, so let me ask you this: They that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. What is that? Who is that referencing? When is that referencing? What time period?
Oh, it definitely the 70th week. So let me just turn there. The elect of God, and I know you would perhaps say that that's dealing with Jews. I know I would certainly say that Jews are included in that, but I would say the catch is if they have believed on Jesus Christ. The context of that even shows that basically those who I should just turn to the passage before I just assume something. Because I believe contextually the elect there is absolutely saints of God, not just Jews in general, for example. Because he's just starts off talking about the disciples, and of course those are saved people.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, in verse 9 in Matthew 24, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. So I see that as absolutely the context of who the elect of God are in Matthew 24. Those who are hated for my name's sake,
Mm-hmm.
which is those who are in Christ. Not just, I know the arguments about the Jews, and I don't have a problem saying that. I forget if it's in this passage or if it's a parallel one. Mentions of like the Sabbath day. Yeah, sure. That saints in Israel would, probably be observing the Sabbath, so I don't have any issue with that. Um, I would say there's a highlight of focus on elect Jews in Matthew 24 in parallel passages, but it's applicable to all the saints of God living up to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And just in general, as exhortation, what I say unto you, I say unto all. Watch, as Mark 13 ends.
Mm-hmm. So
So can you go back to what was your original question you were saying about the time frame and
yeah, the he that
endure
shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. I mean, who's that? What time endure to the end of what? The 70th week?
the second coming at this time.
Endure to the end of this, up to the
Not
second coming, or what? I'm
up
confused.
to the particular coming in Matthew 24, which is the second coming, not the third coming. So if that makes sense.
Okay, so so they're saved from, if they endure to that point, they are saved from the rat. What are they being saved from?
Yeah.
What are they enduring, and what are they being saved from?
Okay. So for example, in verse 22, well, I'll even read verse 21. So, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So
Mm-hmm.
you already see here the saving is in regards to the elect. Of course, I would say the elect. Elect people are already saved, but this particular salvation is in regards to their flesh. So this would be that they're um, persevering unto the end in the flesh, like living up to the time, going through all that tribulation and still making it out alive. And then not to mention that their flesh is going to be transformed into incorruptible flesh at the rapture, which is,
And what are they being
again,
saved from?
what are they being saved from?
Yeah,
Well, I mean, there's tribulation here.
but he that shall endure to the end, the same
Yeah.
shall be saved.
Okay.
So you're enduring to
Um,
the end of the tribulation to be safe from tribulation. I don't. You see what I'm saying? I don't
well,
understand what you're saying.
again, it's there should no flesh be saved. That's what's being saved. So
So the flesh is being saved
yes,
from.
well, from death, I would say, because that's. I mean, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. So he's saying if the days were not shortened, no flesh would be saved.
So it's just talking about death there.
Well, I think we need to understand, like, with tribulation, like in this particular context, would that not be persecution? Like people hunting you down, regardless of who whether you think that's um, save people or not. Like, wouldn't it be a hunting down of people where you're on the run for as a way to think about that?
I mean,
And yeah. In
possibly.
fact, in
So
verse
if you
20,
endure to
but
the
pray
end of
ye
it, you'll
that you
be saved from. But you're being hunted down regardless. So,
yeah.
and if you endure to the
Well,
end of being hunted down, you'll be saved from being hunted down.
not necessarily that. So, how about from verse 20? But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So they're fleeing, so they're running from persecution here.
And why
And
would they be
again,
concerned about the Sabbath day?
like I was hinting at earlier, um, I have no issue with this being elect Jews, like in Israel, observing the Sabbath.
So they're saved Jews observing the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Why would they need to
Or
be
at
worried
least
about?
are in a time frame in which they are accustomed to society revolving around the Sabbath if you're in Israel.
Why would they
When,
need to be worried about the Sabbath if they were running? If they were saved,
well,
why
I
would they
think
be worried about
that's
the Sabbath?
actually what, if anything, I would say that's what Christ is basically saying to them is, oh no, because he says he's praying not that your flight be in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So for whatever reason, if they have to fly on the Sabbath day, that's going to be a hindrance to them for whatever particular reason. I think that would have to do with it could deal with the society at large in Israel. It could also do with personal conscience at that point. If does that help?
And see, that would be the problem with applying this to like a Gentile, a saved Gentile.
And again, that's why I think the highlight of Matthew 24 would be elect Jews and not just in general. Even though I think it's applicable in general to, if Christians are hunted down in America, you should just, flee as you need to.
Mm-hmm.
But no, absolutely the highlight here is focused around like Jerusalem and Israel.
Let me ask you this. I know I want to go to 2 Thessalonians 2.
Okay.
With that, let me ask you this: do you think with 2 Thessalonians 2, do you think the day of Christ is at hand? I'm sorry, I know you don't believe that. I don't believe that. Gosh,
Yeah, the text says very clearly, right?
yeah, that I misspoke there. Do you think? Okay, let me read your Romans. Let me read your Romans 13.
Sure.
I'm sure the Stevies are going to take that little sound bite and run with it. The day of Christ is at hand. When I debated Tommy McMurtry, I said that the day of Christ is the rapture, and I had a difficult time in 2 Thessalonians 2.
Okay.
I've since changed my position. I changed it over a year ago, but I made like an official video on it not too long back, just a couple of weeks ago. I think the day of Christ and the day of the Lord is the same thing. I do not think there's a difference. You would agree with that?
Absolutely. The day of Christ is the day of the Lord.
Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
And I agree with that too. Now, of course, I put the day of the Lord at the end.
Right.
So you would say that the rapture, though, is not the rapture of the church is not at hand because it's the day of Christ.
Not at hand because of the day of Christ. Yeah, because he's saying in 2 Thessalonians 2 that the day of Christ or the coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord is not at hand.
Mm-hmm.
So as in it's not soon relative to when Paul was writing that.
But it could be at hand now.
That's a good question. I mean, I would say generally no, but at the same time, as we see, things going on in the world, we know we're getting closer and closer, right? It's just a matter of
Yeah.
time.
The
But
basic, way that, McMurtry explained it, and I've heard other people of the post-trib pre-wrath, persuasion explain it, is that they will say, well, that it's not at hand because, and they use it to destroy imminency. And so I believe, say, this
yeah,
one too was talking about the rapture. I didn't believe in imminency for a while. I thought we had to see the Antichrist. I thought there had to be a falling away and the Antichrist be revealed. again, I've changed my position because it is quite obvious that the Antichrist, the way he is revealed, is when he's sitting in the temple. Of course, the
Absolutely.
abomination of desolation. So I don't think the falling away applies to the apostasy that we're seeing today. I think that is a falling away during the tribulation period that'll take place. I think there's going to be a great
Yes.
revival after the rapture. And then as the persecution of the Antichrist and the tribulation just kind of expires, of course, I believe a saved man can take the mark in the tribulation period and lose his salvation. I know that is a different topic for a different night, but I do believe that. So it's quite obvious that the day of Christ is not at hand, but you're saying it could be.
Well, specifically from the text, because the way I understand it is he's saying, maybe I wasn't thinking clearly about what I was saying earlier. So, for the way I understand it, because I see the day of Christ as the day of the rapture, he's saying that the rapture is not at hand because there has to come a falling away first and the man of sin would be revealed. I agree the falling away would be talking about within the time frame of Daniel's 70th week before the rapture. So the falling away has to happen, then the man of sin has to be revealed, and then the rapture.
Mm-hmm.
Is how I understand that. So yes, I do agree with the new IFB and using this to debunk imminency.
Okay.
But
Now,
in the sense of like where we are at in the world, do I think if by at hand meaning, and again, I think there's a possibility we could be, like really quite far away from Christ coming, like 50 plus years is possible to me. But again, considering the environment, this new state of the world that we're now in with this virus, it feels like some things could be used there to help set up the 70th week, right? But I'm not necessarily saying that's going to happen anytime soon. In fact, I would say, if anything, the coronavirus is probably hindering the end times a little bit, because if everything's shut down, like you can't have a temple built in Jerusalem, right? If everyone's in quarantine, there's no temple that's going to be built.
right.
But it's going to take some time before that's ready to go.
Well, let me show you a passage. I understand where you're coming from with that. Let me show you a passage in Romans 13, verse number 11, because me and you would agree that whenever the rapture takes place, I obviously believe it takes, place before, you believe it takes place after, that's when we receive the salvation of our body.
Yeah.
And Romans 13:11, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to wake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. That's obviously not talking about the salvation of our soul, because it references when we believe. So when we believed is when we got the salvation of our soul, but this is talking about a salvation that's future and it's nearer than when we believed. Verse 12, the night is far spent, the day is at hand.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So there it's clearly referencing the fact that the day of the salvation of our body is at hand.
Yes.
How would you reconcile that with 2 Thessalonians 2?
Great question. So in 2 Thessalonians 2, Paul's obviously teaching that the day of Christ is not at hand, and you agree with that? Excuse me. In Isaiah 13, which we have as a passage where I'm pretty sure that you would probably say that's about Armageddon. For me, Revelation 13 would, at least in part, be dealing with the second coming surrounding that event. That actually is teaching the day of the Lord is at hand, if memory serves me correctly. So I would say that the difference is kind of a matter of perspective. Perhaps in 2 Thessalonians 2, it's a bit more man-centric, as in, no, the day of Christ is, well, you could actually view it God-centric and man-centric, relative to at least knowing where we are today in the world, and the people that Paul was writing to. The day of Christ was far from at hand, 2,000 plus years, right? Or about 2,000 years. So, the day of Christ was definitely not at hand for them because of what
in
history has
Isaiah,
proven.
here's where a pre-trib view really comes in, quote unquote, handy, if you could use that terminology, because the day of the Lord if you're looking at it from the perspective of Paul anticipating the rapture, the day of Christ is not at hand. It's not, there has to be a temple built. There has to be a falling away, all the tribulation. They're not looking for the day of Christ. It's not at hand. Don't be worried. It's not past. It's not happened. He then goes on to say in Romans 13, though, or I guess Romans 13 written
it is at
before
hand.
that, it is the day of our salvation, the day of the redemption of our body. It's at hand. I mean, it's going to happen at any moment.
Yes.
He's anticipating that. Paul thought when he's writing 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul thinks that he's part of the group that's going up alive, because he says, then we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So he thinks he's part of that alive group. Now, when you have...
I'll comment on that later, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, but then when you have Isaiah 13, for example, in verse 6, where it talks about the day of the Lord is at hand, that's being written from the perspective of Jews in the 70th week, the time of Jacob's trouble. It's being written from the perspective that, hey, we're in the tribulation, and you know what? The day of the Lord, it is at hand. It is coming. We've seen the abomination of desolation. We've seen a man sitting in the temple. We've seen all this. And so now we know that, hey, there's a day coming. Now, no man knows the day or the hour specifically, because the days are cut short, Matthew 24. So I think that having a pre-trib understanding of these passages, if you're looking at them through the lenses of pre-trib, they no longer contradict each other at all. It clears up the contradictions, if that makes sense.
I mean, that's certainly an approach you can take with this. I just see this as like, well, from God's perspective, the day of the Lord, yes, is absolutely at hand, and yet you can also say it's not at hand. I mean, because I think we can both agree. Well, we don't, because we don't necessarily see the day of the Lord the same way, but I think we can at least agree that the day of the Lord, or yeah, because would you say the day of the Lord here in Isaiah 13:6 is the same as, because you're saying the day of the Lord is the day of Christ. So in 2 Thessalonians 2, would he be talking about Armageddon, wouldn't he?
Right. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
day of Christ?
The second, well, in your view, the third advent, my view, the
Yeah.
second advent. Yeah, that's talking about the day of Christ, the second advent.
Right. It's just kind of mind blowing how many layers of interpretation we do on each other like that. But yeah, I think because we can see that, okay, there is a reference to the same day between Isaiah 13 and 2 Thessalonians 2, and one saying it's at hand and another saying it's not at hand. But you know what? There's also, this is another important point. It's actually in Peter's epistles. If it's not, it's in James, that the end of all things is at hand. And but yet we know there's a 1,000 years that has to happen, for example, before
where's the reference
new
to
heavens
the
and
end
new
of all
earth.
things in I don't know if it's 1 Peter or 2 Peter.
Yeah, it's one of those. Let me look it up here. First Peter 4:7. And that, boy, that deals with some other. Oh well, I'm sorry, that I was thinking of something wrong. But yeah, verse 7. But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer, and above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. And then considering that in 2 Peter 3, he mentions like the new heavens and new earth and the destruction of the old, or what is now the current heavens and earth. I have no problem connecting those things together.
Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah, go ahead.
When do you put the revelation of Jesus Christ?
Well, by that you're basically asking about, like, when is the second coming? Is that what you mean?
What do you think, the second coming is the revelation, or do you think it's the in your opinion, the third coming?
Yeah, I would say the second coming and the third coming are a revelation of Jesus Christ.
Okay. So when does every eye see him, and all nations of the earth mourn for him?
Actually, both the second and third coming. And
Okay.
I think, yeah, I think it happens twice. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well,
I think there was something else in Second Peter 3 that helps tie it in, I guess, a little bit more with kind of at hand. Um, pretty sure I've seen that before. Yeah, well, maybe this isn't exactly that, but maybe this is an argument you do not accept. But some pre-tribbers at least would say like, hey, we're not looking for the Antichrist. We're looking for Jesus Christ. Is that an argument you buy?
mm-hmm.
Okay, but at the same time, like Second Peter 3 would say, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and the new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. So,
Mm-hmm.
because we know the new heavens and the new earth are, after the millennium, well, yet the Bible still talks about us looking for these things. If you've heard some of what the new IB would say is like, okay, well, there's Thanksgiving and there's Christmas, right? You can still look forward to both. It doesn't, there's a chronological order, but just because you are looking for one thing doesn't mean you can't look for others beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Does
Right.
that make
Yeah.
sense? So if we are looking for the very end, and we know the Antichrist is something that has to be fulfilled in prophecy, we can still look to those things like for them to happen. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I can't look for the Antichrist because I'm looking for Jesus Christ. You can look for both. We're looking for the new heavens and new earth too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't necessarily use that logic. Like, I'm not looking for Jesus Christ. Like, it's not like the scriptures only commands us to look for Jesus Christ type of thing. It's just like, I'm not looking for the Antichrist because I don't think I'll be here when he's here.
Yeah, and I know what you're probably referring to.
Yeah.
If you were to say that, of course, right? But I think it's just important in mind to think about it like at least on a loose level, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Um. Let's. Okay. So let's. Do
So
you
if
have
we
any
can
more
go back
questions?
to
Yeah.
sorry, Isaiah 13. So I even though there is again Isaiah 13 saying the day of the Lord is at hand, and then Paul saying the day of Christ is not at hand,
Mm-hmm.
I believe both can be true because for one, God said it, but there's also the difference of perspectives. Like, and even in Second Thessalonians 2, he's saying it's not at hand because there's a falling away first that needs to happen. There's a man of sin that needs to be revealed.
Mm-hmm.
Versus for God, who's outside of time, he's seeing everything all at once. For him, and even in Second Peter 3, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. 1,000 years is one day of God.
Mm-hmm.
we can't understand that because we're not even going to make it to live 1,000 years in our current bodies, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yet for God, that's just 1,000 years is a short period of time. Like for us, a day is a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Hey, let me ask you something really quick here with Matthew 24 and Ezekiel 37. I don't know if you ever
Okay.
looked at Ezekiel 37 much. Ezekiel 37 and verse number, let's see here. Oh, verse number 9.
Okay.
Then said he unto me, prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, thus saith the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived. And they stood upon their feet, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army.
Sure.
So you have a reference to the four winds here. And then if you also go to Isaiah 26, verses number 19 through 21. Let me get there quickly.
Oh, okay. That's a great passage. Yep.
You have, let's see where I'm at. There we go. Thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in dust, for thy dew is as the dew of the herbs, and the earth shall come cast out the dead. Come,
Okay.
my people, enter thou into thy chambers, and shut thy doors into about thee. Hide thyself, as it were, a little moment, till the indignation be overpast. For behold, the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth also shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain. So you have a reference there to obviously a resurrection that happens,
Yes.
which you would put when?
Resurrection. So yeah, that would happen at the second coming. But
So
I
Isaiah
would
37 would be at the second coming as well.
Ezekiel. You mean Ezekiel 37?
What did I say? Isaiah?
Isaiah 37.
Yeah, I mean Ezekiel, excuse me.
Yeah, you know what? This is actually, I can admit that this might be a bit of a challenging passage for my position. I think I can connect Ezekiel 37 to something in Zechariah. Maybe I think it might even be Zechariah 14, where you have like Israel and Judah fighting as an army. If it's not there, it's between Zechariah 12 and 12, 13, and 14. And then even in Romans 11, there's the reference to like Israel being like restored from the dead. It's certain that is a bit more challenging, I can admit, but I do believe that nonetheless, I think it's so clear from my position that the resurrection of the dead happens at the second coming, so midweek. So
Okay.
I'll say this: if Ezekiel 37 somehow like does not take place at the second coming, then it probably would be the third coming or close to that.
Well, because if you look at Ezekiel 37, number one, there's the four winds there. That is a
Okay.
cross reference to Matthew 24. Very clear.
Okay.
The
Sure.
elect are gathered from the four winds. Okay. Then you have a resurrection that takes place. Verse 12, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. So when these people are resurrected, they're resurrected a great army, and they go into the land of Israel. The Lord
Okay.
makes them a nation, verse 22, in the land, and they have a king over them, and it
Yeah.
is King David.
Yes. And I'm sure you would agree that's Christ, or do you not agree with that?
No, I think it's David.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's literally David. So my whole thing is none of that happens at the second, in your opinion, what you would call the second advent, the middle of the week. None of that happens then.
Yeah. So I have noticed this before, for sure, and I would say that if this absolutely has to be like for the setting up of the millennium, then this would be at the third coming.
So you believe there's a resurrection at the third coming?
I would say, yeah, I do think so, but I think it would be quite different from the one at the second coming, like a lot less grander. And even from this passage, like all you could say is it's just, the house of Israel, right? Not necessarily anyone else.
Right. Well, you don't think that Isaiah 26 is just referring to the house of Israel?
Oh, it certainly is. It certainly
So
is.
who are the people that get up at
Uh-huh.
the end of the week? Who are these people in Ezekiel 37? Because if everybody's getting resurrected, who's getting resurrected in the middle? Who's getting resurrected at the end?
The best I could say, because I believe there will be, for example, Jewish converts and even Gentile converts during the second half of the week after the rapture. The 144,000 will be witnessing. The two witnesses will be witnessing. Again, there isn't necessarily an explicit reference as to what the 144,000 will be doing, but I think preaching is the best answer as to what they'd be doing.
Right. So who's the part of the first group there?
I'm first group in relation to what, Ezekiel 37 versus Isaiah 26, or
Well, yeah. So let's do this. At the middle of the tribulation, who's getting up? or excuse me, at the middle of the 70th week, who's getting up?
Yeah. So for my second coming resurrection, like who's getting resurrected?
Mm-hmm.
All the saints that have died up to that point.
Okay.
But with the exception basically of Moses and Elijah, because they've actually already returned bodily form with I'd say corruptible bodies.
Okay. Yeah,
Been
I
placed
can
on
agree with that.
before. Yeah.
Okay. Third Advent. What you would call
Yes.
third Advent, end of the 70th week, who's getting up?
Israel.
Anybody
House
who's
of Israel.
died in the 3.5 years?
Yeah, I would say so then, yes.
So the reference to the four winds there, you just think it's not a parallel passage with Matthew 24?
Explicitly parallel, no, but of course both passages mention the four winds, of course. So I mean there is a connection, but I just would see these as different events.
Okay.
But have you noticed the resurrection in Romans 11 as well? Like
maybe
it's the
I
receiving
don't.
of them. Okay,
We
it's not as explicit as Ezekiel 37, but there's like
You mean the receiving of them
from the dead? Yeah.
Yeah. That's in verse. It's in the teens, I think, isn't it?
I think it's probably in the first half or so.
Yeah,
Of
15.
Romans 11.
For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll even admit that because in Ezekiel 37 here, you do have people coming up out of graves, versus I think Romans 11 would be talking more about conversion to Christ, resurrection.
Well, see, and that's
does that make sense?
So I can see maybe
the
the dichotomy
reconciling of the
there.
world?
Right, I can see maybe the dichotomy there, but see, I think that the day of the Lord, the end of the 70th week, and all that, I think that's when they do turn to Christ. I think that's when they see Him and believe on Him. I think that, no doubt, I think there's going to be Jews who are going to, accept it before that. But I think as a national body, that's when they do, as a whole, turn to Christ
at the end.
At the end. So
Absolutely.
These passages don't really, even though I can see maybe one talking about spiritual, maybe one talking about physical, whatever. I think it's all just one event. I think that that's when the new covenant comes in, Israel's converted, and all that.
Yeah, I mean, Ezekiel 37, like, I definitely am a person who's all for literal interpretation. And yes, there is them coming up out of the graves, and you just think immediately literal, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a slight possibility that Ezekiel 37 could be a little bit more spiritual in nature, because it's like, okay, these bones are the whole house of Israel, and it's like, then it almost seems to be like, okay, then these people come up out of the graves. Like, there just seems to be something a little bit more unusual about this particular event in Ezekiel 37 to me. But yeah, I have definitely noticed that this is a little bit more of a potentially problematic passage for my position. I can admit that freely.
Yeah. Well, let's look at one more. We have just gone over 2 hours. Let's look at one more passage, and then we'll kind of close her out here. I'll give you a minute or two to say your last whatever. But one more passage I would like to look at is Daniel 7. I did a YouTube video on this several months back, probably even over a year ago, and of course, the Andersonites just lost their minds over this passage. And so their way of combating that was, to call me queer and, this, that, or the other. So this
That's so irresponsible. So irresponsible.
Yeah. That's whenever they can't answer, somebody, they're just, that person is a homosexual in their minds. Anyway, so
sorry if I could just interrupt you for a second. Like,
yeah,
it's so much better just to admit you have a little bit of a weakness in your position than to be like, oh, how dare you question me? Like, come on.
Yeah. Oh, I know. So if you look here, the passage, let's see, Daniel chapter 7, and specifically, I guess, verse number. I'm trying to look exactly where I would want to pick up. All right, let's just look at verse 21.
Okay.
I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. Now, you would say that that is referring to what time period?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely the 70th week.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that this is like the time period in between the abomination of desolation and the second and the second coming?
So from memory here, this would probably more specifically be the time of Great Tribulation.
Right. Which you think we're here for.
Yes.
Okay. So how long does that time period last?
So again, according to the chart, it's like 75 days. But
Right.
if you factor in something like the day, the sun and moon being darkened before the day of the Lord, potentially 74 days, but it's kind of only a time zone difference. But yeah, so basically
Okay.
75 days. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I saw that. I studied Anderson's chart very, intricately. Verse 22. So he makes war again and prevails against them
Yeah.
until the Ancient of Days came,
Yep.
and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom.
Hmm. Yeah.
So he makes war against the saints until it's time for them to possess the kingdom.
Yes. And so, okay, so even I do believe there's a highlight of the time of Great Tribulation, but I do believe the Antichrist still hunts down saints after the rapture, but it's going to be to a significantly less extent because of all the giant judgments that are going on in the world. So he'll still be doing what he can to hinder the cause of Christ, but it won't be nearly as effective as it was in the first half of the 70th week.
So do you think, okay, so wait a second. Do you think he's hunting down Christians the entire first half of the 70th week?
I think he's doing it.
'Cause I
Well,
didn't
that's a
think
great
that happened
question.
until the fifth seal.
Well, because in the fifth seal, again, they get to the altar because they've died, right? So there is you could look at fifth seal as being great tribulation. I would say in general, I would say saints are going to be dying even like all throughout the first half, but it's going to get much worse during that 75-day period.
Okay.
That's like the culmination of, you know, the success of the Antichrist.
Okay. So you would just say that that's just highlighting when it's real bad.
The worst of it, yes.
Okay. So when he does it until the time, so you think that that's referring to the time after the rapture has already taken place?
So great question. So until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given. So I would actually see this particular coming for the Ancient of Days in 22 as like the third coming, actually.
Well, but he comes in the clouds, though. That's the problem.
Well, I don't
Because he
necessarily
comes,
see. Yeah, go ahead and make your point on that.
yeah, because he comes in the clouds in verse 13. I saw in the
Yeah.
night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him.
Okay.
And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people. So when Jesus comes in the clouds, he's receiving a kingdom. But according to you, when he comes in the clouds, he's not receiving a kingdom.
Uh, there's like so many things I could bring up about this. Without getting too divergent, so in verse 13, I actually see like two comings here. And not the comings I'm necessarily have been referring to of the second coming and the third coming. So I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. So that this is definitely Jesus, came with the clouds of heaven.
Mm.
So I would see this as like primarily the second coming of my understanding of it, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. So, okay, so he's coming with the clouds of heaven. So for the rapture, and then he's coming to the Ancient of Days, God the Father. So that's in heaven. And they brought him near before him. I would see the they as the saints, like bringing Jesus near before God the Father in heaven.
So you would see that as the second advent.
Yeah, I would see that as the second advent. Yep.
And what
And there,
kingdom is he receiving in verse 14?
this would again be more for the setup of the third coming. So I would say there's a gap.
Okay. You're a gapper.
Yes. And by the way, I don't believe in the gap theory for Genesis 1. I'm not sure if you
But you
do,
believe
but
it here.
yeah, I believe in a gap here.
Okay.
And by the way, and there was given him dominion and glory and kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. Um, and by the way, I would even say that when Christ comes, I think there's one of the it's either like Mark 13, Luke 21, Luke 17. One of those passages would refer to the coming of Christ as his kingdom, I believe. But I would see that differently than like the millennial kingdom, which is what I would say is being referred to definitely with verse 14 in Daniel
You would
7.
see it differently as the millennial kingdom.
Daniel 7:14 would be referring to the millennial kingdom.
Okay. And what passage did you say would not be referring to the millennial kingdom?
There's something in one of those Olive and Discourse type of passages.
Okay. Well, listen, why don't you take 2 or 3 minutes and give us kind of like a closing statement here.
Oh boy. So yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion, by the way. Thank you for having
Yes,
me on.
absolutely.
And I can admit that, hey, if you were to just listen to this, maybe you shouldn't believe in pre-wrath based on the content just purely here, because I didn't get to necessarily explain why I believe what I believe about this. I just sort of said I believe it. I would say for people looking to deal with this complex subject of the rapture and the end times in the Bible, um, the I would say the real backbone of why I am post-trib pre-wrath and the way I say it is because of the chronological order of Revelation 6, 7, 8, and 9. I believe if you were to walk through those passages, there is just simply no way, taken as they are, that we'd be able to apply, like, say we're just switching time frames. No, it's clearly chronological. And if that is the case, therefore, Matthew 24, when it's talking about after the tribulation, that lends itself to a different understanding of Daniel's 70th week than has been typically taught about it, where you have perhaps the tribulation in the first half and then great tribulation in the second half. So this is proposing a new idea, relatively speaking, of how to understand Daniel's 70th week. And again, if you walk through Revelation 6, 7, 8, 9, if you just take that as it is, I believe there is just simply no way we're going to be able to undo that clarity that is there. And there's so many parallels to like Matthew 24 between Revelation 6 and 7. And the great multitude in Revelation 7 that comes out, these are they which came out of great tribulation. Clear parallel to Matthew 24, where we had great tribulation, and then immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun, moon being darkened, and then second coming. And then if you realize the implications of that, that requires there to be a third coming of Christ for Armageddon. And I would even see Daniel chapter 12 as a way of speaking about the second and third coming, but in sort of hidden ways, not like hidden, but hints at those being that. I would say Daniel 12 verses 12 and 13 show us the second coming on the 1335th day of the 70th week. And then from actually verse 11, it mentions, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. I see this talking about the end of Daniel's 70th week, which would be the third coming. And then from verses 12 and 13, I see that as the second coming. I realize that, okay, you first started with third coming, and it goes on to the second coming. But I would say to that, Daniel 11, or excuse me, verse 11 deals with from the time frame of the abomination of desolation, so the midweek, and then 1290 days to the end of the 70th week. Verses in verses 12 and 13, we have blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. It's the 1,305 and 30 days. Considering that we're dealing with the book of Daniel, I believe it's absolutely a safe bet that this is dealing with the first 1,335 days of that week. Especially if it's talking about the 1,305 and 30 days. Another important reason I think to be holding this position is because of what the Bible says about the last day. The last day is mentioned in particularly the Gospel of John. In fact, it might even be the only book that's specifically mentioned, but talks about the resurrection being at the last day, and it begs the question of, okay, how did the Old Testament saints know this? For example, in John 11, you have Martha, I believe, teaching that, well, she's believing that Lazarus would be raised again on the last day. Well, where did they learn that from? I submit to you that they got it from Daniel chapter 12. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. This will be talking about Daniel being raised from the dead, and it's at the end of the days, therefore it's the last day. And when you look at the context, there's the resurrection of the dead clearly mentioned early on in the chapter about them to sleep in the dust of the earth. And here you have Daniel. He's going to rest. He's going to sleep. And he's going to do that until the end of the days, 1,335 days. Yes, there wasn't a subject we necessarily dealt with it very much in this broadcast, but when you see it that way and you realize the profound impact of the chronological order of Revelation 6, 7, 8, and 9, that's why I'm pre-wrath. And when if you were to look at 1 Thessalonians 4, the clear rapture passage, you can see the clear parallels between that and Matthew 24, and that Paul's referring to the same day as then. And I submit to you, with this type of understanding, it requires a relatively radical new understanding of eschatology than what's typically been taught about pre-trib or post-trib.
Okay. Well, folks, thank you so much for watching. There's a few of you still left. So thank you for watching. And thank you, Project Could, for coming on and discussing this with us. This will be available on YouTube. Everybody like and share it, though, on Facebook. We want to get the word out. Again, Project Could, thank you for coming on with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was great. Maybe we can do it again sometime about other things.
Absolutely. All right, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in. God bless you is our prayer.